séance. Conformément à l'article 108.2 du règlement, nous reprenons...
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, we are continuing our study of federal contribution to reducing poverty in Canada. This morning, I wish to thank the witnesses who are appearing before us. With us today are representatives from the Canadian Council on Social Development, the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and representatives from Informetrica Limited. We will begin with Ms. Scott. I will remind you that you have 10 minutes to make your introductory presentation. Each one of the witnesses will have 10 minutes, and then we will move to the question period. In fact, we'll begin with Mr. Shillington.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you once again about poverty in Canada. I know the committee is interested in speaking about poverty definitions, but I'm only going to say a few words about that because I think it's a diversion.
C'est juste pour vous présenter pour votre organisme. On commencerait par Madame Scott.
I'm sorry, we're actually going to begin with Ms. Scott. Can you hear me? No. I just wanted you to introduce your organization, but we're actually going to begin with Ms. Catherine Scott, who is the Vice President of the Research Branch of the Canadian Council on Social Development. Mr. Glenn Drover is a social worker and social policy consultant with the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Mr. Drummond White is a social worker and Board of Director member. And Mr. Richard Shillington is Senior Associate with Informetrica Limited. Ms. Scott, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the committee for the invitation to come and speak to you today. Certainly it's a topic that's near and dear to our heart. I'm with the Canadian Council on Social Development, and for those of you who don't know the Council, I always describe us as the grand old lady of social policy in Canada. We've been around for 80 years. Certainly our earliest concerns date back to the 1920s, and poor children, certainly in the post-war period, and we've evolved over that time and have and are now a large national, nonpartisan research body that focuses on social policy issues and certainly has done research in the area of poverty and poverty measurement. As Richard said, I understand that you're interested in poverty measurement. I've been asked to talk a bit about a study we've done on urban poverty, so I thought that I would start my comments by setting that frame about the work that we've done on the issue of urban poverty, and then certainly I'm happy to entertain questions that you might have about poverty measurement and the like. We're actually in the process of doing a piece of work for some federal provincial committee on poverty measurement, and so I'm happy to field any questions you might have about that and how we measure or don't measure poverty in Canada, as the case may be. As I said, I was asked to come and talk to you about some work that we've done now for many years on urban poverty in Canada. It's been an interesting process because for many years we didn't actually have any way of understanding poverty at the community level. We didn't have the data to do that. And about 10 years ago now, the Council, together with a number of municipalities and community-based organizations, got together to purchase the data necessary to start to understand what was happening in communities. The research that we published recently, actually based on the 2001 census, and luckily, and next month you're lucky because the income release from the statistic, the 2006 census is due out in May. Actually in a few weeks, actually. The work we've done certainly was based on the 2001 census, begins to unpack some of the complexity of poverty at the local level. This was an important thing to do around 10 years ago because the understanding was, as the dynamics and composition of poverty changed, that poverty was emerging as a huge issue in Canada's large urban centres. And certainly the work that we've completed this past, over these past few years on the 2001 census data bears that out. This isn't to say, and I'd like to start by saying very quickly, this isn't to say that poverty isn't a very real and pressing concern in rural areas in Canada, but that in terms of sheer numbers and the acute character of poverty, it has emerged in Canada as a specifically important urban problem. And there are many factors we could, if you're interested, we can talk about why that is. But certainly Canada's largest cities have the highest poverty rates in Canada. Through the work we've done, we've sort of been able to unpack some of that. And you'll have probably noted in many of your communities, actually, that you now are seeing local poverty studies, and different patterns are emerging. What's interesting, it's important to note that poverty, while it's highest in urban areas in Canada, the way that poverty and the composition of poverty in individual communities is very local. So you have cities such as Toronto, for instance, where you see or are beginning to see the emergence of the suburbanization of poverty, where poverty is now becoming concentrated in the inner suburbs of Toronto. You have cities like St. John, New Brunswick, for instance, which is classically, they have a very deprived inner city core, and so forth. And in Vancouver, for instance, the dynamics of poverty changed substantially through the 1990s, where you're beginning to see enclaves, the cities of Richmond, for instance, and Coquitlam, who used to be historically have fairly low poverty rates, actually have much higher rates of poverty because of the concentration of new immigrants. And so when we talk about urban poverty in Canada, I think it's really important to understand that it really is still a very local phenomenon and has everything to do with the composition of the communities and the patterns in the populations, particularly vulnerable populations in those communities. I wanted to touch a bit briefly on the one comment I made, though, about the trend toward the suburbanization of poverty. That has just, I think sometimes we're very influenced by what we hear in the United States, and certainly that has been an enormously important force in the United States, where you see the hollowing out of major, certainly you see that in the Midwest cities and the like, hollowing out of major cities and concentration of disadvantage. That same pattern hasn't emerged to the same extent in Canada, although we are starting to see that in places like Toronto and Montreal, where gentrification has taken hold in the core and people are being displaced. Poor people are being displaced to inner suburbs and the like, or in Richmond and certainly in Vancouver, where they're going out to other communities. I guess, as coming back to the point that, again, it really does reflect the composition of the population in communities. And our study details in some detail, and I hope you'll be able to look at some of the profiles we've done for individual communities, the different rates of child poverty, poverty among seniors, new immigrants, certainly in the West, concentrations of poverty among Aboriginal populations, which has been very important. So you'll find in cities like Calgary and Edmonton that have enjoyed reductions in poverty, certainly through the 90s, and continue to enjoy that now, that they have what have emerged acute pockets of poverty, certainly among the Aboriginal populations in cities in Western Canada. So I hope I brought actually the entire report, and I'm happy to to answer any particular questions. But I was when I come away and I think about what were some of the major findings, really it was that Canada is not a uniform country, certainly in any way. Our diversity is very much reflected in the urban poverty landscape, and that as you go to think about solutions, I think that needs to be taken into account, that certainly we can talk about, and it's critical to create strong foundations, institutional supports, but that local poverty reduction initiatives are really important in that context, because the nature and character of urban poverty and community and poverty in Canada varies so widely. I think that was certainly the main conclusion that we came to based on the urban poverty report. I was conscious of the time. I wanted to talk as well a bit about some of the findings with respect to kids and immigrants in urban poverty, with regard to urban poverty. I think the situation with children has been interesting because certainly our findings in our report roughly that back in 2001, and these data are based on the last census, that roughly 1 in 5 children in our large cities, or 1 in 5 residents in our large cities were poor, large urban areas, certainly areas like Ottawa, Gatineau, and Toronto and Vancouver, but that roughly 1 in 4 children were poor. And I don't think that statistic is a surprise because higher child poverty rates typically are higher than average poverty rates. And certainly when we look at communities across the country, the highest rates of child poverty were in Montreal, and the lowest in Vaughan. You see quite a huge range between cities. But interestingly enough, you'll find communities where the child poverty rate is actually much lower than their national, the city rate would suggest. And those cities actually are in Quebec. And I think what was interesting in this finding was, and why I bring it to your attention, is that public policy can make a difference in lowering rates of child poverty, certainly, or in targeting rates. And in Quebec, of course, there have been an introduction of public policies that have targeted kids, and we're starting to see some evidence that that's making a difference. Conversely, when we look at immigrants, and immigrants by and large are a group that have higher rates of poverty, it is only those communities where they have large populations of recent immigrants that experience the very highest rates of poverty, where you see differentials of 40 percentage points between poverty rate of Canadian-born citizens and the poverty rate of immigrants, and particularly new immigrants. And again, those are in communities such as in Vancouver, in Montreal, and Toronto. So again, it comes back to the whole theme of diversity and understanding that different policy instruments will be necessary to tackle these very serious issues. I'm struck certainly by the literature when we looked at where to, that even the most even the practitioners or the advocates of very locally based poverty solutions, and we see sort of an explosion actually of interest in poverty reduction across the country by community groups that are mobilizing and taking leadership on this issue. And I mean, I commend the committee for taking this, that all of these groups come together and they point to the need, the critical need for a strong federal response to poverty reduction to create the foundation so that local solutions can thrive. I am quite struck that the need for both we have a need on the one hand for universal or general policies that target all individuals, as well as spatially focused initiatives such as you see emerging. And I think that's going to be a critical frame for this committee as it considers the federal contribution to tackling issues such as urban poverty in Canada. Because without strong programs such as OAS, GIS, without a strong child tax benefit program, without a progressive tax system, without strong support for public services in health and education, any locally based initiative is destined to fail, and I think that it's important to keep that in mind. And even when you look at some of the experimental literature on best practices from other countries, and we can talk about that, when we look, for instance, the United States, which has some exemplary anti-poverty programming, the absence of critical infrastructure such as public health and the like invariably signals failure on the large rate, that they've not been able to move their certainly poverty rate problems of poverty in the United States because in the absence of those critical foundational pieces such as public health care, access to high quality education, public health, housing. Housing has actually emerged as a critical issue in urban poverty, and you're seeing that.
Je dois maintenant vous interrompre, Madame Scott, malheureusement.
Yes, okay.
Pardon me for interrupting you, Ms. Scott, but your time is up. You will have an opportunity to answer questions, though, later on. We will now move on to the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Mr. White.
And thank you very much for inviting us to join you this morning. My name is Drummond White. I am representing the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and that's a federal body consisting of 9 provinces and and the North. Our profession has as its guiding light the pursuit of social justice, the strengthening, of course, of our profession, and enhancing excellence in regulation. But the number one goal of our professional association is the pursuit of social justice. And it's in that light that we have spent a great deal of time and effort and of course our own resources in dealing with issues of poverty. Today we're focusing here on, as we have over the last several years, on women's poverty. We have sponsored a number of papers, the last being the issue of the poverty of elder women. The list of papers, Declining Health and Well-Being of Low-Income Women in Canada from 2 years ago, Financial Security for Women Seniors just last November, and Women's Income and Poverty in 2004. Glenn Drover, who is our social policy consultant, will be doing the majority of our presentation, and I certainly will be available for questions as well as Glenn will be. I turn the floor to Glenn. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Thank you. We've been asked to focus, I understood, on more of the strategies and solutions related to women's poverty rather than the facts and issues. We did give you a written submission, and that does include a documentation of some of the issues related to women's poverty and also the policy challenges. But we'll try to just highlight a few of the possible strategies or solutions that we think might address women's poverty. But before doing that, there are just 2 quick points I'd like to make in terms of the issues. One is that the gap between men and women's income and the relatively higher level of women's poverty in Canada is persistent. It's been ongoing for a long time, and that gap has not significantly been reduced. Women more than men are likely to be poor. Children in considerable measure are poor because their mothers are poor. And older single women are disproportionately poor because of their marginal location in the labour market. Other developed countries, particularly in Northern Europe, have been able to reduce the gap quite significantly between men and women's income and the level of women's poverty, more than we have in this country, and we think that the European countries offer you some good benchmarks in that respect, and we understand that you'll be looking at some of them. We have four principles, because we think principles are important when you're trying to look at the issue of poverty. In relation to women's poverty, we think that fundamentally the high employment rate is very significant for low-income women in developing sustainable jobs and is essential to reduce poverty. As we see it, work is the basis of welfare. Secondly, that supportive social policy includes a family perspective and gender equality, and they are fundamental factors to promote security and the well-being of women. Thirdly, that social inclusion and equal opportunity for women as well as men requires adequate, accessible, financially and sustainable social protection. I think that's just echoing what Catherine said a moment ago. And then women stakeholders, the fourth point, should be involved in the design, implementation and monitoring of social programs that affect their lives and their livelihood. Very often, as you well know, they're designed by men. There are, on the basis of these 4 principles, 5, what we would call 5 multidimensional proposals that if we pursue, we think would help to alleviate the poverty of women. The first is to revise the poverty line or low-income cutoff so that it is more comprehensive and reflects the reality of women's lives. And as Richard mentioned earlier, and Catherine, you apparently are interested in that issue, and we do have a publication on that, and I think it's been given to the committee, particularly in relation to women. And we think a composite poverty line is important in order to establish targets for a reduction in the rate of poverty. The second is a proposed reform of welfare and employment insurance. It's based upon the model of the Caledon Institute, and I assume that you will have that or do have it. And we will just try to echo it and say why we think it's a useful model. The third set is a promotion of active labour market policies for women, based upon particularly the European experience and the European research. The fourth is a proposal to improve retirement benefits such as OAS, GIS and CPP, because unlike men, women primarily draw upon those for retirement. That is not the case for a lot of men. And the fifth is the modification of housing supports and subsidies, which we think can be changed to improve the accommodation of the senior women, of women in general. So I'll just go over a few of those things just to explain it a teeny bit and then leave it the rest to the discussion. One is the idea of a composite poverty line. We think that is possible. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the UN index. Other European countries have developed composite index in poverty. The advantage of doing that is it just doesn't rely upon income. The research that's been done in England around that issue shows that, in fact, when you use other indices, you get different results. So by having a composite index, you probably get a better picture of poverty. And for women, certainly, a lot of issues just don't get picked up with income issues because it's based upon household or family data, very often as well as individual data. And for the women and families, it says nothing about how those resources are used within the family. And very often women are shortchanged on that one for sure. So a composite index, we think, is kind of important. So we just kind of stress that, and our report elaborates how we think that can be done. The reform of welfare and EI is a model that's been put forward by the Caledon Institute. It's a three-tiered system, as you probably know, with the first tier being basic income support for anybody looking for employment, the second tier being more geared towards services operated by the provinces, and the third tier for the disabled. They will, I'm sure, elaborate on that when they speak. We think it's a value for two reasons. One is that it gives the federal government main responsibility for the income transfers and the income support. And that's the level of government that can sustain and support these things, and other countries in the world have done that much more than the provinces can, particularly around the welfare problem. And secondly, it is a clear division, we think, of the powers or responsibilities of different levels of government, a distinction which this current government has been stressing and which we support. The third area is in terms of active labour policy. Recent European research confirms that active labour market policies of various kinds, whether it's in relation to standards, discrimination, equity issues, and so on, as well as various types of support, show that women disproportionately take advantage of those programs in Europe and end up employed quite significantly at higher rates than men. So we think that that sector certainly needs to be developed within Canada more. And as part of that, we think also that childcare is a very important part, because without that, certainly single-parent mums are not going to be able to move into the workforce in any significant way. And it's important to keep in mind also in relation to that childcare, because the arguments are often made in terms of childcare and the advantage to children, that it is also advantage in terms of labour productivity, and to keep that in mind. So the fourth area is improvements in the OAS, GIS, CPP. I won't get into the details of that. We can get into that if you want in the discussion, but there are various ways in which we think those programs can be improved to assist women in relation to both the OAS, GIS in terms of making it more accessible to some women who are currently excluded, and also in terms of CPP, in terms of opening up that program a little bit so that the disadvantages that are offered to women, one disadvantage is that women who drop out of the labour force for caregiving reasons other than for children, for example, in middle age, to take care of a senior member of the household or to take care of somebody else, doesn't have the same dropout provisions that a child care mother does. And then finally, in relation to housing, again, we won't get into the details, but there are two aspects about that we think are important. One is to much bigger push in terms of shelter allowances, housing allowances. At the moment, almost all shelter subsidies are tied to social housing units. They're not free and don't float with the individuals. And then the other aspect is trying to move toward more mortgage accessibility for low-income women. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Chair.
Vous avez encore une minute si vous voulez en bénéficier.
You have 1 minute remaining, Mr. White, if you wish to use it. You have 1 minute remaining to speak.
D'accord. Monsieur Shillington.
Yes. I know that this committee is interested in speaking about poverty definitions, but I'm going to say only a few words about that because I think it's a diversion. I will illustrate why I'll downplay the definition of poverty with an example. A single senior in Canada without an employment pension, without an employer pension, has an income of about $15,000. Roughly $6,000 from old age security, on average $5,000 from Canada Pension Plan, and $3,000 or $4,000 from GIS. This is not a great deal of money. Roughly half of Canadians retire without a pension plan. This is the median. Half are below that, half are above that. 82% of single people who retire without a pension have an income below $20,000. Would we all agree that these people are living in straitened circumstances? Are they poor? Depends on your definition. Let's talk about a single senior woman in Quebec. Median income about $17,000. Some of them have a pension, some don't. And I'm using the last year that I can get comparable data for, which is 2000. The poverty rate for single women in Quebec, with the median income is $17,000. The poverty rate using the low-income cutoff before tax is 65%. That was now 15 years ago. If I appeared before the committee, we would have been done. We would have said the poverty rate is 65%. But we've made some progress. The after-tax LICO gives you a poverty rate of 38%. Same people. Their incomes haven't changed. After-tax LIM, the low-income measure, poverty rate is 21%. Using the MBM, which was created by officials in the federal government, the poverty rate is 5%. Okay, so we've made a great deal of progress. The poverty rate has come down from 64% to 5%, and we haven't spent a penny. These changes in the poverty rate will, of course, have no impact on the well-being, the standard of living of those women. The programs that influence the standard of living of poor seniors are not debates about poverty measures. Right? These are programs. So over the last 25 years, what have we done that might influence the income of those women? Old age security has been indexed to prices only since 1984 and hasn't changed except for that. GIS, 3 years ago, I would have said the same thing. It was increased a couple years ago by $36 per month. That's the only increase in GIS, the main program for low-income seniors, $36 per month over the last 25 years. CPP has improved because there's increasing participation rate of women and there's more participation rate in general. And so CPP has gone up somewhat, but the maximum CPP is $10,000 and the average is $7,000 and the average for women is $5,000 per year, not per month. Now we've made some tax changes. We've increased the age credit, we've increased the pension credit, we brought in pension splitting. None of that will have any influence on the women we're talking about. I think we'll all acknowledge these people are not taxpayers. We've increased the RSP limit. We found the funds to do that. And in the last 25 years, we've increased the RSP limit from $5,000 per year to $20,000 per year. I suspect that won't have much influence on these statistics. I'm going to talk now about programs. But before that, I've given the committee a poem. Poverty Is, from children in North Bay. These are not economists. They will not talk about before tax, after tax. They will talk about what it's like to be a child living in poverty. And what I want you to notice is they're not talking about malnutrition, they're not talking about housing, they're talking about social exclusion. That's what they see. And if this committee chooses to think about poverty, they will think about social exclusion. In my view, the anti-poverty measures that we have brought in as a government fail because they are targeted at the poor. They are designed, implemented, and administered by an elite that has no contact with poverty and no understanding of the lives of poor people. And I'm not exempting myself. I'm part of that elite, and I just think I know I don't know. We encumber our anti-poverty efforts with regulations and red tape because of our paranoia that they might be overly generous or abused by poor people. Our efforts to target benefits leads to eligibility criteria, clawbacks, disincentives that simultaneously help people up while holding them back. Virtually all our support programs, which are targeted at low-income people, encumber the recipients as a price for assistance. These programs are narrowly focused to keep costs low. The narrow casting, based on mistrust and suspicion, creates inequalities, complex eligibility criteria based on income and asset rules that nobody in this room, I contend, knows in detail, creating marginal tax rates that are often more than 100%. Most of the programs I'll talk about have parallel programs for comfortable Canadians, us, which are less encumbering and where we spend more money and are more generous. Do I have a couple minutes? I want to quickly go through a raft of programs. 4 minutes. Good. Do I get his 1 minute? Quickly go through a raft of programs where I think we could improve the well-being of low-income seniors. And I'm not interested in debating whether or not that will improve, whether or not their income will go across that imaginary poverty line figure. OAS. Very quickly, OAS, is everybody here aware that the amount of OAS benefit that you get if you're an immigrant depends on which country you came from? Generally speaking, you'll get more money if you immigrated from a developed country than from a South Asian or East Asian country. CPP. If you're low income, you get CPP, it's clawed back out of your GIS. Problems with CPP take-up and retroactivity. I've been talking about this for 8 years. The number of people who are eligible for CPP, overwhelmingly women, who the government knows who they are, where they live, they're eligible for CPP, they're not receiving the benefit. When they apply late, they do not get retroactive benefits, despite the fact that this is a contributory program. GIS, 50% clawback. The new $3,500 exclusion, good step. But why wages only? Why not earnings? Why are we allowing it $3,500 of wages excluded, but not self-employment earnings? So again, it's a narrow casting. It's trying to be restrictive. Widow's allowance. If you're 60 to 64 and you're low income and you're single, you can get a very generous, relatively, income support as comparable to OAS-GIS if you're a widow, but not if you're single, not if you're separated, not if you're divorced. What's that about? Right? If he dies the day before you're divorced, you're eligible. If he dies the day after, you're not. 24% of the private sector has an employer pension plan. 18% of the private sector has an employer pension plan that you would want. We are going to have a lot more people in the future. And we know the coverage rates for pension plans are going down. We're going to have a lot more people. OAS, 6,000. CPP, 10. Max, 7. Average, 5 average if you're a female. GIS, 3,000 to 4,000. The more you get income from other sources, the less GIS you get. 82% of people retiring without a pension have an income below 20. 2 minutes? I'll go very quickly. Prescription drug plan coverage. Deductibles and copays which are much higher for the public plans than for the employer plans. The public plans, I mean the plans that are administered by governments, have formularies, lists of drugs they cover. The employer plans that most of us would have don't have that list. If your doctor prescribes it, you're covered. Employment insurance. Cut in benefits of 1/3 in the last 15 or 20 years, 1/2 for poor people. The poorer you are, the less likely you are to be eligible for benefits. Maternity benefits under EI, which about half of new mothers get, 55% replacement, no more than $400 per week with a 2-week waiting period. The employer plans, 93% replacement, no 2-week waiting period, no maximum. Look at what Quebec's doing with the Quebec Parental Insurance Program. It's superb. It's not perfect. It's a huge step in the right direction. And again, here's a benefit program for low-income people, which is much more restrictive, targeted, and less generous than a program for what we call other people, valued Canadians. Learner bonds. What a wonderful idea. The take-up rate. This is a benefit to go into RESPs for low-income Canadians. The last I looked, the take-up rate was still less than 10%. Money available free for people who are low income. Student loans, Millennium Scholarships. We're going to give people money, let's make it taxable, and then some provinces took it out of their student loan. Learn Save, a demonstration program to encourage savings amongst low-income Canadians, and then after the fact, finance decides we couldn't live without this money being taxable, which means it's clawed back out of your child benefit and GIS. Child tax benefit, a wonderful program, a wonderful initiative if you're working poor. But you probably know how people on welfare felt about the child tax benefit and how it influenced them and how they were used as Sherpas to ship money to the province. The work income tax benefit, not a bad idea. You can't get it if you have been a student of 3 months in the last year or your spouse. Like, why are we doing this? I don't understand. Child care. There's so much that could be done in child social housing, welfare, which is not a federal responsibility, but we can do better. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup d'avoir respecté votre temps.
Thank you for respecting your time limit. I know that it's rather short, but you will be given an opportunity to complete your presentation later on as members ask their questions. Each member has 7 minutes. Ms. Squirrel will begin. She's a member of the Liberal Party.
Ask one question and turn it over to my colleague. And it's impossible to know where the one question is. I want to first thank you for talking about solutions, which is very much where we're going to try to focus the study that we're doing. And Mr. Shillington, we could go on forever with you too, and I don't know where to start. But I guess I want to go back to Mr. Drover in particular. We talked about the composite index given the fact that we're trying to look at LICO and MBM, what is the number that we're going to have to try to decide is that number where everybody should be at? Could you elaborate on the composite index that you referred to? In particular, the concern was that men and women, the gap is going to be there for, I would imagine, quite a few years before we can really narrow that down. And you referred to it specifically for women.
Well, what we did was look at the initiatives of other countries to get some sense of what they were doing. They didn't, in fact, specifically focus on women, but they did develop composite indices. And then we looked at the research around women's income, both within families and individual women. And on the basis of that, we developed 4 indicators we felt that were kind of important, from our research anyway, to add, because it provides a multidimensional. I mean, one of the good thing about the composite indices that have been developed in Europe particularly is that some of them show, in fact, that people turn up, and I guess it's reinforcing the point that Richard made, depending upon your definition, what you include. So that different people will turn up as being poor depending upon the indicator that's used. But we felt for women in particular there were 4 areas around education, because their level of education oftentimes is influenced considerably differently from men. Health indicators, because both life expectancy, maternal mortality, relations, violence and so forth that affect women's ability to work, quality of housing, those sorts of things. And those kind of measures to some extent have already been developed, particularly in housing standards. Employment indicators, in terms of their employment, their record of employment participation, the longevity of their employment, things of that sort, and also relation to the family support. One of the astonishing things that still persists, and I unfortunately have not seen studies in Canada, but there are certainly studies done in almost most European countries and several countries around the world, around the differential incomes within families. And for a variety of reasons, low-income women are disproportionately a disadvantage in that respect. So we feel by having indicators related to what's going on within the family, around the kinds of supports they're getting, the kind of independence they have in terms of their income sources and so on, would be important. So those are the kind of indicators we felt that were possible. Those various indicators have already been tested to some extent for other groups in other countries, so they are possible.
Could I just follow up on that briefly? I think what's interesting in Europe is that a number of countries have actually adopted a suite of indicators to track poverty and material deprivation. And in fact, I think one of the troubles or stumbling blocks that we've always in Canada, because we've obviously been in this place of limbo for many years around whether the LICO, for instance, is a poverty line, is not a poverty line. I mean, I actually happen to take Richard's point of view that these sorts of things are a bit of a diversion, is that any measure is going to be as good as it is designed. Measures are targeted to reveal particular things, and there will never ever be one perfect poverty measure. And I think what we need to sort of understand is that we may well need different types of measures to track different types of important things. The LICO, which is much maligned, actually is a very important historical measure. It has been a very credible and a rigorous tracking of low income and income inequality in Canada these many years. We do not have measures, for instance, of material deprivation, and that's what Glenn was talking about. In Europe, they've actually supplemented their relative income poverty lines with a series of deprivation indices, and they report on both. Ireland has taken the step and created a combined measure, but if you look at England, when they announced their target to reduce child poverty significantly by 2020, they introduced 3 different income measures to track their progress, some of which are better targeted to actually tracking program outcomes, and others are tracking income and inequality outcomes, both of which are important. So I guess the idea that we need one measure, I think, is wrong-headed, and maybe the committee could think possibly and constructively of a suite of measures to move our agenda forward on this very important topic.
If I might point as well, very simply, I would suggest that if we look at a very simple measurement, we may end up with a very simple solution. And I would suggest that the address to poverty should be a broad scope, which includes the access to employment, which includes a range of services such as child care. When we were talking about family formations before, who has access in the family to the resources of that family? You know, if we have 2 people working, but only one person has access to the finances, is that an equal family? Those are the kinds of issues that we need to address in a wide-ranging kind of way. So if we look at a narrow definition of what is poverty, I don't think that will address the issue. I don't think that will produce the solutions that we need to produce a more equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think your presentations were excellent and definitely engaging. Lots of questions, as my colleague Ms. Groh said. I'm going to direct mine to Mr. Shillington in the view of time from our chair, who tells me that I have 2 minutes. Number one, what are your thoughts in regards to the composite poverty line that's being proposed by Mr. Drover and Mr. White? I believe that it focuses on 4 factors of education, health, employment, and family support. And do you think that we need a basket sort of measurement? So that would be the first question in regards to your thoughts. And secondly, you were going to touch upon some more solution-based options that exist for childcare and for housing to help reduce poverty in the country, and if you could elaborate on that, please.
Let me answer first. Make some. I'm not going to answer your question about poverty, because I don't think there's a consensus in this province in this country, sorry. I don't believe there's a consensus in this country about what our obligations to low-income people are. Okay? To me, a poverty line reflects an acknowledgement that there's a political or a cultural obligation. And is our obligation to the poorest of Canadians that we will keep them alive from Monday to Tuesday? You know, if that's your view of our obligation, then welfare will be a money sufficient to keep them alive for another day. And your poverty line will be a poverty line that reflects that. How many people have enough money to stay alive? If you believe that your obligation is that the money should be more than that, the money should be sufficient so the people in the family can participate in society with some level of dignity, then you will have a broader poverty line. If you believe that the children in the family should be able to go on the field trips that the schools run, read that Poverty Is poem, right? Then you will have a different poverty line than if you believe that, no, because that child's poor, we will understand that that child will not be able to take music and art in the classes in the school that require extra money, and the child will not go, and that is fine with us. So to me, before you decide what your poverty line is and whether or not it's absolute or relative, whether or not it changes with social conditions, you will have acknowledged whether or not our obligations to low-income people is a basket of services which will keep them alive from day 1 to day 2, or is sufficient resources to participate in society. And I haven't answered your childcare and housing because I want more time.
Thank you, Ms. Dalla. Mr. Ménard will now ask his question on behalf of the Bloc Québécois. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask 2 questions, and I want to begin with Ms. Scott. In the briefing notes that were prepared by our researchers, your organization talks about dividing the CHST, the Canadian Health and Social Transfer, and having one transfer that would be dedicated exclusively to social services and another transfer for post-secondary education. Can you please elaborate? Can you also talk to us about the possible advantages and disadvantages? And I will have 2 other questions for the 2 other witnesses afterwards. But my first question is for you.
Yes, we've, number of years ago made a recommendation to, at the time when the CHST was still one transfer, to certainly break out the health transfer and the social and education transfer. That, of course, was since done 3 years ago now, and subsequently made a recommendation to break out the social transfer from the PSC. That was nominally done in the last, no, not the last budget, the 2007 budget. We felt very strongly that given the origin of funding for social services, and in particular anti-poverty programming that traced its roots back to transfer programs after the Second World War, and most recently in the Canada Assistance Plan, that it was certainly in terms of accountability, it was much better to break out the transfers in order to clearly track whether the actual level of transfer was sufficient to meet need in the provinces in programming in these areas. Certainly, in the analysis we did, these funds have been nominally divided. I don't think they've been physically, as I understand it, in the 2007 budget. The analysis we did at that time suggested actually the level of funding that was going, including the formula to bring all provinces up to a single standard, a single per capita formula that's going to be introduced in 2009, that the level of funding actually is still, for social programs, it's still less than it was when CAP was rolled into the CHST in the mid-90s. Certainly we have ongoing concerns about the level of funding to support anti-poverty programming, but we do think that the division has been important in that regard to help us track and understand that.
Parfait.
Perfect, thank you. I'm very pleased that you are participating in the study of this committee, but as our hearings move on, it becomes increasingly obvious to me that this committee runs the risk of falling in a trap. The trap that people realize that the government does not dispense social programs. The federal government exercises powers in taxation. The GIS is an example. The government does not intervene directly in the healthcare field or in the educational field. It does not act directly in those areas of jurisdiction. There are two things that it acts directly in. There's the entire issue of discrimination. Do you believe that this committee should at last recommend building in to the Canadian Human Rights Act, and I'm not talking about the Charter, I'm talking about the piece of legislation, a prohibition to discriminate on the basis of social status? Some say that that would allow people to challenge the Indian Act, the Indian Reserves Act. The piece of legislation that the Liberals once proposed about increasing the number of hours eligible, hours needed to be eligible to the EI. Now, do you agree with me that we need to urge this government to build into the Canadian Human Rights Act a prohibition to discriminate based on social status?
About 7 or 8 years ago, there was a Canadian Human Rights Act review panel. Review of the Canadian Human Rights Act. I wrote a document of about 50 pages on exactly that topic, about whether or not it was feasible that some prohibition against exploitation on the basis of social condition was feasible within the Canadian Human Rights Act. And it is not a simple thing. If you can't decide who's poor and who's not, then it's hard to decide when people are being discriminated against on the basis of poverty. But I think it can be done. And there's an extensive paper there that basically talks about there's obviously people who are being exploited because of their financial vulnerability. And if you think about it that way, could you write legislation that prohibits the exploitation of vulnerable people because of their financial situation? Of course you could.
Est-ce que j'ai encore un peu de temps, Monsieur le Président?
Do I have any time remaining, Mr. Chair? Of course, please go ahead.
I'm reading here from our own social policy principles, and one of them is equality, one of them is equity. And I'll read the statement on equity full out. Individuals and families are treated equally if they are in like circumstances. Social inequalities are considered just to the extent that they result in compensating benefits for the least advantaged persons in society. So the implications for us is basically not that some people are treated especially well, but people are treated so that they can rise to the same level of equities as others.
OK. Deuxième rapidement, parce que je veux pas dépasser.
Now, very quickly, because I don't want to exceed my time limit. Now, on the issue of housing, to your minds, what kind of efforts need to be deployed by the federal government in the area of housing, because we know that this is fundamental to reduce poverty?
I can talk about that in relation to our proposals, there were two areas that we felt that were important. One was the development of a housing allowance. It's allocated as a direct transfer or a tax credit and would be a benefit to low-income women. Many other countries have done this, so it's nothing new. We've also experimented with here, and we have it to small degrees in Ontario, for example, but it's not comprehensively developed. And it would balance the current system of subsidies as we see it, because under the current system it's all tied to housing units, whereas with the idea of the allowance it's tied to the individual. So it's a different, very, very different kind of focus, and gives the individual a lot more choice in the housing market. And the other one is in relation to housing mortgages. Now, this is a very sensitive area in light of what's happened in the last half dozen months in the United States and elsewhere. But nevertheless, there is potential here for the development of mortgages for low-income people. Again, Ontario, I believe Quebec is also initiating some small programs in this area. But to use the Ontario example, at the moment, the so-called affordable level is what they call the fifth quintile, which, if you were to take the City of Ottawa as an example, would mean you have to have an income of $71,000. So we're not talking about low-income people, clearly, when the Ontario program is operated. And even in Ontario, it's $23 million. It's less than 3% of their total affordable housing program. And the affordable housing program in this country, as you know, is very meager. So, in fact, that kind of initiative, each of these examples, both the allowance as well as mortgage support for low-income people, is possible, but done on a very, very, very minimal scale in Canada at the moment.
Oui, vous allez avoir l'occasion, Monsieur White, de compléter.
Mr. White, you'll be able to complete your answer to the subsequent questions. Mr. Martin, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I thank you for coming and taking the time to make your presentations this morning. We're, as you know, grappling with the sort of federal role or federal responsibility where poverty in the country is concerned. I don't think we need to look much anymore at, is there poverty and what does it look like? I think we have a pretty good idea that it's there. As Mr. Shillington has said, we've spent a number of years now trying to define poverty and not really getting to actually dealing with poverty, and in fact makes a good case that perhaps the exercise was trying to define poverty out of existence as opposed to actually doing something about it. Catherine, you talked about local approaches to unique challenges in different areas in the country. Glenn and Drummond and the Association of Social Workers have talked about women and the fact that poor children, which we've sort of latched onto in a fairly I think dramatic way in the country, but poor children are always attached to poor families, and in most instances a poor mother trying to look after that child. Richard, you talked about social exclusion, and you had an experience at Christopher House in Toronto where you actually did come in contact directly with folks who are living in poverty and heard from them, and I think did a wonderful piece in the Toronto Star at one point. So I guess the first, you also reference a poem that was written and actually first published by ISARC in Ontario, called Poverty Is, which, if anybody's interested, is actually on my website if you want to go there and check it out. But it is a wonderful description of the day-to-day challenges of children as they grapple with the issue of poverty for themselves and for their families. But what in your view, as quickly as you possibly can, should the federal role be, given all that you've said here this morning? We can start with Catherine. We'll work our way across.
Well, I'll come back to what I guess the argument I was making in my short presentation was that while I think local initiatives, poverty reduction initiatives that are sparking across the country are critical to address the specificities of different communities, and I think poverty does look very different in different communities, that it's critical to have a foundation, and the federal government has a very important role in creating an equitable income security foundation for Canadians across the country, regardless of where they live. It has wholly and adequately a principal role in creating income security programs targeting different populations, that provide adequate and equitable levels of support. I think it also has an important role to play in obviously social transfers to direct services at the local and the municipal level. I think as well it has an important role to play in the immigration system, and it has an important role to play in the housing. The federal government has moved back from housing, and I don't think it's an accident or a mistake that when we started to see poverty rising in the 1990s and income inequality emerging, it was at the same time where you saw a significant reduction in federal and provincial monies in the housing, in social housing and housing programs, just at the time when private market housing was taking off. Affordable housing remains a critical problem in Canada, and certainly in our large urban areas is a significantly a factor contributing to persistently high levels of poverty. Interestingly, and I leave this as well, another area to consider, colleagues of mine in Calgary pointed out that they're doing a study of looking, we've talked about, there are different types of poverty. In England, for instance, they measure poverty rates based on housing poor. They also talk about fuel poverty. In many United States communities and in Calgary, they're starting to look at transportation poverty, where people actually can no longer afford to live in areas adjacent to places of employment and are spending upwards of 30% of their income on transportation in order to get to employment. And this is an emerging phenomena that has everything to do with the pattern of suburbanization and economic development at this point in time. So the idea that we are now seeing the emergence, certainly among the working poor, of transportation poor, I think is important, and it speaks to what is the role of the federal government in investing in public transportation infrastructure that facilitates more equitable communities. And I think it's important that we think about that. I think the federal government certainly would have a role to play in that regard as well.
I'm not going to repeat what Catherine said, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think are important to be brief about the distinction. One, I think, is that there has to be respect for the division of responsibilities between the federal government, the provincial governments, and territorial governments. And that means, for me at least, and for us, I think generally, that we see various types of income transfers as largely the responsibility of the federal government. It has the resources to do that across the country. It can create equity across the country in doing that in the way the provinces can't. And historically, to some extent, it's been accepted. Services and programs should be and are the responsibilities of the provincial government, territorial governments, and should remain there. That's why, for example, in terms of our housing proposals, if you understood them, I think what we were saying is both the allowance and the mortgage kind of benefits are essentially income transfers of one sort or another, and we saw that as a federal responsibility, not a provincial responsibility. In the housing sector, there are lots of initiatives, most initiatives are really provincial responsibilities in relation to housing, but there can be income transfers in the housing sector that can be clearly pertain at least to the federal government. The other thing I would say around the poverty measures, I think there is an advantage in the federal government developing a composite poverty measure. I would say that there's an advantage politically, because one of the experiences, or results of the experiences in Europe is in developing these composite measures, they more and more engage more and more the public in defining these things, and they began to in fact, that because once you just focus on income, people tend to yawn or take a disinterest, say, I have that level of income and I can get by, so the other person can't get by with 10,000 or 7,000 or whatever. But when you start asking people themselves, engaging people in that exercise, it begins to change political attitudes about poverty. And that was a significant development, side effect, so to speak, of the development of poverty measures in Europe. And I think it would be a side effect here as well. And I think that is a federal responsibility, because again, it's national in scope. And the final thing I would say is in relation to demonstration projects, because there's so lots of things, best practices, based upon other countries and what have been done in other countries, where the federal government can take the lead.
Thank you. I think in addition to the specifics that my friend illustrated, it's important that the federal government and the federal parliament take leadership in engaging the Canadian people in this discussion about what it means to be a Canadian, what the aspects of social programs and social well-being are. That kind of debate, that kind of dialogue is essential for all of us in our country. And as well, of course, just as in so many other areas where there is an overlapping of responsibilities, it's also, I suggest, a responsibility of the federal government to take leadership, to develop the program, to develop the dialogue, to develop the research. Thank you.
Merci. Nous allons...
Thank you. Mr. Lake from the Conservative party will now ask his questions.
Just like to start by thanking you all for being here today. This is obviously a really important study for us, and I often say that regardless of the party stripe, we all want to see poverty decrease in this country. We have maybe some different ideas on how to get there, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get some new ideas from you in terms of this. I just want to clarify a couple of things. I heard, Catherine, I heard you say, I think when you were answering a question from Mr. Martin, you referred to poverty rising in the 1990s. Now, everything that I've read right now says that poverty is decreasing and has been decreasing now for some time in Canada. Can you maybe just clarify the measures that you were talking about?
Certainly. Well, poverty did rise through the early 90s and has said around 1997, depending on the measure, started to come down. But the increase in the early mid-90s was not only directly obviously related to the business cycle, but it was also driven by rising housing costs and other expenses. So certainly what has continued to increase, poverty has basically been trending down from 97. It's basically been static around the 11, if we're using the after-tax LICO, it's basically been sliding sideways around the 11% mark for the last 4 years or so. Income inequality has continued to grow, so the gap between the rich and the poor, as measured, actually has grown, and that's actually a trend that's evident in many industrialized country, advanced industrialized countries. In Europe, actually, in the United States, it's even more pronounced, where you see income concentrating in the hands of upper-income Canadians.
Now that segues nicely into my next question for you. We heard a witness on last Thursday who talked about purchasing power, and there's a lot of talk about what's happening in Europe and what happens in the States and kind of comparing. Now, the witness that we heard last Thursday, I think it was from Stats Canada, it might have been from HRSDC, but they were talking about purchasing power, and when measuring purchasing power in the U.S. or Canada versus the European countries that a lot of people point to, the Nordic countries particularly, when you point specifically at the 10th percentile, so the place where 10% of the population is poorer and 90% is richer, so it's a relatively low-income percentile. Our purchasing power here in Canada is actually higher than the European countries. Purchasing power in the States is actually higher than those Nordic countries that so many people point to. Can you maybe comment on your research on that, or what you know about that?
I think what you're talking about are some of the there have been some international studies that have looked at the relative well-being, or you're right, of low-income people in the United States versus low-income people in Canada and those in Europe. Often, not only this question of purchasing power, but what kind of access to low-income people in those countries have to public goods that, which are services and benefits that aren't captured in income statistics. As it happened, when in comparison of, certainly as the research with which I'm familiar about U.S. and Canada, that low-income Canadians are in a relatively better position than low-income Americans, given the comparative natures of our welfare states and access to public goods, and particularly with access to public health care. I think that's correct. How you take account of that, which really then becomes a methodological question, how do you take account of access to public goods, resources in your calculation of poverty measurement? There are many methodologies that have been devised for that.
Right. Well, I think that's part of the challenge, right? Because as I look at sort of keywords as we go through this, and I think in terms of my responsibility as a member of Parliament, stewardship is definitely right up there, and balance, and considering consequences, and sometimes unintended consequences. I look at this study by John Richards, who was a former NDP MLA in Saskatchewan, who did a study on poverty.
Many years ago, yes.
Yeah, many years ago, but you're right. But he did a study on poverty, and one of the things that he talked about, I referred to some things talking about the changes to the EI program and some provincial changes to welfare that he said contributed to a decrease in poverty, increase in employment, and a decrease in poverty. But one of the points that he makes as well is he talks about the areas that of people that maybe are not quote-unquote employable, and how I don't want to put words in his mouth, but sometimes when we put too much focus on helping people that are employable, thinking that we're doing the right thing, perhaps we don't have the resources left to help the people that are truly not employable, the people that need the help the most. And I've heard a lot of talk from all of the witnesses today in that area, how there's certain groups of people that need specific help. And I guess I'd like your comment on that in terms of that balance and how we manage those public dollars.
Well, I'm sort of thinking how I'll leave the critique of John Richard's piece to Richard, but the point you're making about the deserving and undeserving poor is a long-standing theme in Canadian, certainly in Canadian or other Anglo countries, long tradition dating back to the 16th century. I agree with you. We do tend, and this speaks to what Richard was saying, we do tend to have very value-laden approaches to anti-poverty programming, and certainly the emphasis on labour market participation that's been evident in Canada and elsewhere since really since the late 80s, I would argue, has tended to push, for instance, the design of the National Child Tax Benefit. One of the explicit goals was to mobilize the labour market participation of parents. That is directly stated in the legislation. As a consequence, the characterization of people, for instance, who are unable to participate in the labour market, I mean, yes, I agree that you can have the consequences is that particular group of people with their needs can be overlooked or denigrated. I mean, one of the things that I would argue about this kind of rigid idea that you're in the labour market, you're out of the labour market, you're a participating Canadian, you're a non-participating Canadian, you're a taxpayer or you're sludge. This kind of division is very unhelpful, and in fact, when you look at someone, for instance, the disability community, they would tell you that they are happy and desiring of actively participating in employment and in community life. They may not be able to be full-time members of the labour market given the chronic nature of their disability, but we have rigid income security programs that make people have to fit them into square holes and pegs. You're either all in or you're all out. And many of the programs, certainly in social assistance, the design, forces people into those boxes, and that's not helpful. Your global question about whether we have an envelope of money, and that the more we focus on making people employables, the less we focus on other groups that don't have the same access, don't have the same potential for labour market participation. I guess I see that a bit differently. I think groups have their own needs, and we have to think about it differently, and it shouldn't be constructed as a zero-sum game, that there's a range of supports that we need to create a foundation and a base that addresses those needs.
I'll give you an example of something that I consider a lose-lose. I have several foster brothers, and I have two foster brothers in Alberta. I'm not going to name them, but I have two foster brothers who are on what's called AISH, Assured Income for the Severely Handicapped.
Yes.
Now, in my view, both of those foster brothers are employable. I've had several conversations with them. They've gone through some pretty tough circumstances that they may need help with, but surely they're not severely handicapped to the point where they don't need to be working. In both cases, they live in basement apartments, and pretty much their life is consumed right now by surfing the internet, playing video games, things like that. They're in their 20s. I would make the argument that in both cases, their life could be a lot better than that. They contend, when I've had discussions with them, that if they were to get a job, that they would lose their AISH. That's their concern.
Yes.
I would also, without going too much into provincial politics, I would also make the argument that the money that they receive, while it's not that significant amount of money, I think they could be making significantly more money if they were working, especially in the Alberta environment right now.
Sure.
Could probably be better spent on people who really, truly need the money. And so in my mind, I look at that as a lose-lose, in a sense. You've got the unintended consequences of trying to help these two individuals who really are probably worse off because of the help that they're receiving, I think. And at the same time, that money is not being spent in another area where perhaps it might be able to help people who truly cannot help themselves.
Well,
that's a concern that I have.
Sure. I know, and I think it would be interesting to hear Richard on this.
I'm sorry, Ms. Scott. Mr. Lake has exceeded his time. I'm sorry, by quite a few minutes. What we can allow for is that they can complete their answer to other questions that are going to be asked by other members. Now, the next round of questions will be 5 minutes for each member. Mr. Murphy, the floor is yours.
I want to thank everyone for the presentations, and This is a very important and broad topic, and this committee will be looking for policy instruments, but also has to be somewhat respectful of the jurisdictions that we're involved in. And when I look back, some of the instruments that I believe have worked to a certain degree, not perfect, but the child tax credit and the guaranteed income supplement. And when I look out, there's a number of different cohorts that whether it's Aboriginals, disabled, but one of the groups that I see out there are the unattached individuals, mainly between 55 and 65, probably predominantly female. There's health issues, predominantly self-esteem, whatever you call it. Those people are on provincial social assistance right now, totally inadequate for any kind of dignified living, and extremely small allowance, and it's just not acceptable in this century, in this country. And but again, that's a provincial jurisdiction. Has there ever been any empirical research in taking the guaranteed income supplement and taking it back to cover the 55 to 65-year-old cohort? And what are the costs, the merits, and the obstacles in such a scheme?
A couple comments. I happen to know that there's about 150,000 people on welfare in Canada who are 55 to 64, because I just kind of have a habit of remembering numbers. And we know that most of them are probably not going to bounce back into a job. And the welfare regulations will strip them of any assets and any hope of improving their circumstances. So this is probably, I would say, serving no useful purpose. I mentioned in my presentation, I'll come back to it, there's a widow's allowance program, which is for people who are 60 to 64 who meet an income criteria, and it will give you about $13,000 a year. Not a lot of money, but certainly perhaps double what they would get on welfare. There's about 20-some-odd thousand people getting the widow's allowance. There's about 120,000 people, single people on their own, who meet the income criteria for the widow's allowance, but don't happen to be widowed. And there has been a Supreme Court challenge of the widow's allowance on this marital status discrimination. But, you know, there's a perfect example of what you're talking about. The federal government could say, well, the federal government's already giving it to widows, but not single people divorced and separated. Those people, if they're on welfare, in Ontario, they would be eligible for $6,000 a year, serving no useful purpose. I know that Caledon published a paper recently on the cost of taking the widow's allowance broader. So there are some papers out there. And there's a precedent in the widow's allowance.
And that also, that goes into my second issue. If has there been any studies done on the, we all know that income level is one of the determinants of health care costs. And once you're in that 55 to 65-year-old bracket, you're into increased health costs. Has that ever been analyzed as to possible decreases in health care funding from a provincial point of view, which in some provinces is coming close to 50% of their budget?
I'd like just to make a quick comment. There may be data, and I'm unaware of it, but I'd hate to think that we would provide health care only if there's a cost-benefit analysis that makes it a positive return.
No, but it should be taken into consideration in the discussion, because it is a determinant of the...
I take your point, but I think you understand what I'm saying as well.
Is there any, for this committee going forward, is there any international examples that the committee should be looking at? And I know Canada is a unique country. Any international country that this committee should be looking at as an example, where they've taken this issue and through public policy made some constructive steps? No, generally speaking.
Oh. Well, I can start the discussion on that. I mean, I think there are several countries in Europe. I mean, as I think the committee would well know, the Scandinavian countries in general are quite ahead of us in this regard, while maintaining high economic growth. So both at an economic level as well as a social policy level. They set a kind of a standard. But in addition, England, certainly during the Blair administration, moved quite dramatically to address a lot of these issues, some of them successfully, some of them less so, but nevertheless did experiment and have come up with some measures of success. So happens that Wendy Thompson, who was one of the people who headed up that initiative in England, now lives in Montreal at McGill University, and might be worthwhile talking to get some better sense of what's going on, what went on there. And she certainly is in touch with what's going on there currently, so you'd have a good sense from that. And other initiatives have been taking place both in France as well as in the Netherlands in terms of these kinds of initiatives now. France has run into a lot of difficulty because of their income security programs, the high level of them, and as a consequence of trying to get people back to work and so forth. So, and again, one of the programs there that's been relatively successful is for employment of women, particularly middle-aged women. One of the problems you talked about is not only the 55 to 64-year-olds, but particularly when you get down in the lower ranges there, that women still can contribute quite significantly to the economy. So you don't have to write it off as an income transfer there. Perhaps in the 60 to 64, that's the case, and that's, I would, agree with what Richard said earlier, that the allowance and trying to extend that down to single women and so on would probably take care of that cohort. But under that, and what the other thing I would only stop in saying is generally I would say in most Northern European countries, they have welfare systems who, frankly, on the whole, are not much better than our own, but they have far fewer people on welfare than we do. And it's because of these other kinds of initiatives, particularly employment market initiatives and other kinds of income transfers for family and childcare, that they keep people out of welfare, including these people that you were talking about.
Merci, M. Drover. Nous allons passer maintenant à M. Gourde.
Thank you, Mr. Drover. Mr. Gourde, you have the floor. I want to congratulate you for the excellent work that you are doing and thank our witnesses for being here this morning. I want to give our witnesses the opportunity to tell this committee if or how we should measure poverty. Should each province have its own measure? Or should there be one single national indicator? Because obviously there are all types of definitions of poverty. There is the working poor. There are people who do work but who are considered poor even though they are earning income. Do you have any silver bullet to propose? I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Bullet. I guess my earlier comment was I don't think we have a single poverty measure, silver bullet. One measure won't do all of the tasks that we need. But I would recommend, on your question whether we need a national measure, I think it's very important to have a set of national measures that can be used to compare or to assess the well-being of people living in Corner Brook and those living in Prince George. I think it is important in countries such as Canada to have standards and measures like the unemployment rate, GDP, and the like that are broadly applicable across the country. I think we do need relative income measures like the LICO, and we can debate the pros and cons of the particular methodology, but that's important, tracks low income and income inequality. But I would argue that we need to continue to develop a series of deprivation measures, whether it's the NBM or a list of material deprivation. For instance, New Zealand has a very interesting living standard index that they have developed over the last decade as part of their social report, which would be very interesting. And it provides, it would provide more of a direct assessment of people's access to basic goods and services, in some ways similar to some of the measures we have around housing, but following up on Glenn's point, it would provide a more direct assessment of people's actual living circumstances, and I think that would be hugely useful, certainly in a policy and a program context, and such a measure could be developed at a provincial or a community level. One of the this suite of measures, and I made this case earlier around the United Kingdom, one of the things that has happened in the United Kingdom is that they have made a significant investment in data development and measurement at the local level. They have an extraordinary website called their Neighborhood Statistics website, and I can leave the address with the clerk, that provides for 32,000 communities in the United Kingdom, which is extraordinary, incredibly detailed information about community living circumstances and material deprivation in those communities, and compares them, actually, their status or their ranking to the other communities in the UK. They call it a swingometer, which is, I think, sort of a funny term, but that you, as a community, or a resident member, can log onto this website and find incredible range of information. But it takes, but it took the federal government or the national government in England making that decision around poverty, prioritizing it, and making the investment in data development and measurement, so that 10 years later they have these data that are tremendously useful. So I would recommend a suite of measures that Canada needs to look at creating a deprivation or a living standard index. I think would be tremendously useful to do.
Oui, Monsieur Delover.
I would just add two things to that. One is that I think the advantage of a composite measure is it allows for differentiation across the country and allows you to take into account the diversity, whether in Quebec or elsewhere. The other thing is that I think that I would say that all poverty measures ultimately are relative. They're always going to be debated. That debate won't go away. The advantage of a composite measure is you take into account more things, and therefore I think take into account more people's perceptions and attitudes. And I think that has been the gain in those countries that have moved in that direction. It isn't so much that they'll significantly come down at poverty levels that are vastly different, frankly, from what we have. We compared in our study, which, and you have the report, several countries with Canada in terms of the income transfers and the income levels that were acceptable under LICO and other types of measures. And they vary quite a bit, of course, across countries, but you can also get some commonalities. In this deprivation measures that Catherine referred to, again, in the research that was done particularly in England in this respect, they found, in fact, that they were, there was an iterative process in terms of what was happening, and one type of measure tended to reflect certain kinds of differences, but also some commonalities with the income measures. So we're not talking about things that are going to be widely disparate. We are talking about diversity in order to enhance a better understanding of poverty amongst the Canadian public, as well as amongst politicians and others who have to implement some sort of measures to address those questions.
Merci, Monsieur Drover. Merci, Monsieur Gourde.
Thank you, Mr. Drover. Thank you, Mr. Gourde. We will now move on with Mr. Kostner. I'm sorry, Mr. Ménard? No, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. Mr. Ménard has the floor. Please go ahead. You know that I can't be that accommodating, Mr. Chair. I want to talk about another aspect of poverty. It's something that we don't talk about often. It's the issue of financial services. I know that the CMHC has talked about this in previous reports. Can you please talk about microcredit? I represent a Montreal riding. There's rampant poverty, and if somebody needs to have access to $300 or $400 in the case of a breakdown of an appliance, it's very complicated. There are practically no banks in my riding, and very often the banks want nothing to do with microcredit. Major banks are very reluctant to lend money. And a few years ago, I was traveling in the United States to talk about and study the Randisman Act. It's very interesting because in America, since 1977, there is an obligation upon financial institutions to provide microcredit to poor segments of the population, such as the black population and Hispanic population. So I want to hear your thoughts about microcredit, the role of financial institutions, and if any of you share those recommendations.
I don't know anything about it, so I wouldn't want to say anything.
Unfortunately, but I don't know. I have personally been on the board of a credit union, and certainly know that in the north of Ontario and in Quebec, there are many caisses populaires who are very active in that area, and are many credit unions. But the idea of making a federal obligation for access to microcredit to me just makes a great deal of sense. I'm here speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of the CASW. Thank you.
Just briefly, we haven't done any research in that particular area. We certainly know that for many years now, certainly the National Anti-Poverty Organization, dating back to the mid-90s, has lobbied the federal government around access to financial institutions, federal government in its role as a regulator of financial institutions, to widen the accessibility of financial services to poor individuals. There's been some progress. I can't see, but in fact it remains very problematic. Certainly I know that some provinces are now taking steps to regulate pawn shops and the predatory lenders and check cashing services, which is starting only now. The United States actually is much further ahead and has, for a long time, as you pointed out, actually required financial institutions to create that support. And microcredit, and there are a number of foundations in Canada, for instance, that work on First Nations reserves, who actually work in third world or developing countries and have great expertise around microcredit and have used that, certainly as I understand, in community economic development as a standard tool. So certainly I think it's an important area that we need to look at, particularly as it pertains to financial literacy and exploitation.
Is my time up, Mr. Chair? You have 1.5 minutes left. That's wonderful. What we could forecast, well, you know that the government is very concerned about the user fees that are being imposed by banks. And we, as federal lawmakers, we can look into setting standards that financial institutions would have to adhere to, because cash machines are charging $1 or $5. So we can start a study about how banks are serving the poor through the use of microcredit, for example. I think that's something that falls well within federal jurisdiction. We, the Bloc Québécois, since 1995, have been tabling private members' bills on that very subject, and those bills were studied by the Finance Committee. That's all I have to say, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ménard. And now, Mr. Cosner, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get 3 questions in here. And I want to thank the witnesses as well. It's been excellent sharing of information here. With material deprivation measures, I'd like to get some sense as to, I know, and my colleague Sean Murphy and I had this conversation that when we grew up, we both lived in communities where there wasn't a great deal of affluence, and everybody was poor, and some people were dirt poor. And obviously society has changed considerably over the last number of years, but what are some of the basic needs that people aren't able to meet right now in today's society? The poor people, what are those basic needs that they aren't able to meet? If anybody might want to.
You're asking about the types of questions, or what types of items might be included in a deprivation measure for that sort of thing?
What are things that are they? You had said the comment was we're not seeing malnourished kids. It's not malnutrition. We're not that deep, but there are social exclusion. So what are some of the basic human needs? If you could just highlight those and put them on the record. Anybody?
Do you want to start?
I now wish I hadn't said that. I was referring to this poem. I thought in the poem they're not talking. I'm not suggesting there's no lack of malnutrition. A couple examples of things you might think about. We know from surveys that there's very little income effect on accessing a physician. There's huge income effect in accessing a dentist. Mm-hmm. Huge. The chances of accessing a dentist if you're a low-income Canadian without employer health benefits is exceedingly small, and you can see the effect when people turn to age 20. Right? Prescription drugs. Yesterday's Globe and Mail had this horrible story about this child. If that child's parents had been employed by the provincial government or the federal government, that drug would be covered. I'm sure. I don't know that for a certainty, but health benefits. What are the things that we, as credible people with good jobs that carry benefits value. We value maternity benefits, we value drug plans, we value dental, all of those health benefits that are subsidized by the Treasury through the tax system. Those are generally not available to the working poor. Mm-hmm. So, and those are areas where you could exercise and just take it over. If the employers aren't going to provide it, then do it. We are, I think, heading for just extraordinary inequality in the incomes of seniors, as the disparity between the incomes at retirement of people who had very nice pensions all their lives compare to the half of the population who retire with no pension plan and have average incomes of $15,000.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll throw right back at you. Then I'm sure all witnesses would see some merit in a national program, and I know we want to be cautious with the jurisdictional responsibilities, but a national program. I have people that come to my constituency office, and it boils down to them making decisions as to whether or not they buy their medication or they put food in the fridge. So if I could get your comments on a national program, pharmacare or catastrophic drug program, if you might want to weigh in on comments on that. Anybody?
I'll jump in because I actually did a fair bit of research for Senator Kirby, which was used, and I have actually, in my paying life, my salaried job, did a lot of work on pharmacare coverage. Generally, the pharmacare problem is a maritime problem. In terms of, you're talking about people who do not have coverage whatsoever, people who have no, it's basically working age in the Maritimes. And actually, some provinces are now moving into that area, thankfully. I believe Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And many of the provinces have, certainly the prairie provinces have reasonable, but the deductibles are extraordinarily high. You have like $800,000 deductibles for a public plan targeted at the need, whereas I think your deductible is $60, if that. Mm-hmm. So we have a program which is far less generous for the poor, which is standard. This is what we do with maternity benefits, child care, everything. The programs for the poor are less generous. Now, I don't know if the federal government has an initiative around catastrophic drug coverage, but that's strictly for catastrophic. That's for your $4,000 or $5,000 drug care. And we're talking about life and death here. You know that. So we move that ahead. You know, what I would do, and I have no idea if it's in your jurisdiction, there are formularies attached with all these drug plans. And I would say that in each province, the formulary for the publicly administered drug plan shall be the same as the formulary of the person who administers the program, his employer health benefit. Because I always like to latch on to self-interest, which is why Canadians understand why we don't want two-tier medicine, right? The reason we want one-tier Medicare, so we're all sharing the same program. Mm-hmm. And we don't do that on dental. Okay, back to my one last quick comment on that. This poem about kids, right? Yep. It's about hot dog days. Yeah. It's about field trips. Yeah. How early does a child who's low income in Canada learn that they're low income? I suspect they learn very quickly. If they haven't learned by the time they're in kindergarten, grade 1, they learn there. Mm-hmm. When they discover that they're not going on the field trip. Or they can't take art. Okay. That's it.
I got 2 out of the 3. And that's
Did I use his term? I'm sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Excellency. C'est au tour de Monsieur Brown.
Mr. Brown, it's your turn.
I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I think that many Canadians in their busy lives don't really think about a lot of these issues, and I'm glad that this committee is doing this study, and I think many of you have got some good insight and can help us here. But I'm going to go to Ms. Scott first, and I'm going to go back to the question that Mr. Lake asked about support for those who presently are actually employable, and maybe moving some of those resources to those who are unemployable. I know you didn't get to finish that question. Maybe you might like to do that for us.
I was going to say that that example, and I certainly responded that I don't tend to see it as a zero-sum game, but what that example said to me as you were speaking about it, Mr. Lake, was the enormous number of disincentives that continue to be built into our low-income security programs, where your foster brothers would feel that it was in their self-interest to continue, and assuming they're making a set of rational choices. And I think that's true on income security programs across the country, that people where, for instance, a single mother would face the terrible choice of giving up her dental coverage or her access to clothing allowance for winter. We were talking about what do poor people go without? Warm clothes for their kids, real boots, to wear to school, then, participation in a variety of things that we force low-income people who are reliant or dependent on income security support systems to make these terrible trade-offs all the time. That was what I was going to say in response to how I heard your example with your foster brothers. In terms of the question about whether we spend disproportionate, that said, the idea that we're spending too much money on active labour market programs or training for low-income people, well, in fact, that's not the experience in Canada. Canada actually stands out as actually having a fairly undeveloped training, assistance, and apprenticeship program, particularly for low-income people. I think that there's much to be done in both ways in offering supports for people on income assistance programs, not only to participate in the labour market, but for those who would be able to participate in other forms of community life. And I speak from my own experience of having a brother with developmental disability, providing those opportunities to people to participate in their communities. And we've really not done a very good job of that in Canada to date.
Okay.
Could I add?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
I'd like to add in particular one group, a very significant group, single mothers in this country, many of whom are largely unemployed, and many of whom probably would like to be employed. And the problem is not so much of their willingness to be employed, but the disincentives to employment in this country. And the other feature, I think, is that if you compare our training programs with some of the European programs, there are greater depth to their programs and there's greater longevity, the longer periods of time. And one of the things we've tended to do, particularly I think with single mothers and people on welfare, is that we have tended to go for the quick job to get them off welfare and get them into a job which may or may not last. So they recycle in and out all the time. Whereas the Europeans have gone for the long term and looking at the markets ahead have moved toward middle to high-end jobs as much as possible. One of the realities with a lot of these single mothers is that they're reasonably well educated. The problem is the care of the kids and other kinds of things that they have to deal with and the family supports that are necessary to get them into the labour force. So you have a large, significant group there who are not currently being touched in any realistic way.
Okay, thank you. Just one more quick one for Ms. Scott. You said that some places in the U.S. have exemplary poverty programs. Maybe you can tell us where and quickly give us a little bit of the background.
Well, I guess my comment there was, if you look at the certainly in the literature on poverty programming, you have extraordinary experimental design programs in the United States. I mean, obviously, in their early Head Start programs, for instance, were led the way in terms of identifying the types of supports for poor kids, integration, school dropouts, zones where they're really tackling school dropouts in inner city in certain American cities. But what happens is that you'll have these fabulous experimental designs, one-off programs, but they've never been able to scale them up or ramp them up, partly because of the scale involved or the lack of other public infrastructure that would support these types of initiatives. So,
where would one of those programs be that we might be able to?
Well, it would depend on what you're particularly interested in. I can follow up with you after, like if you were looking at school dropouts or training programs for low-income workers or those sorts of things. It's just that it's an interesting feature of the United States where some of the best thinking is brought to bear, but their public systems don't tend to support. And so they've actually had quite long-term persistent problems with poverty. So, but I can follow up afterwards with a particular example for you if you'd like.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Tour de M. Martin maintenant.
It's now Mr. Martin's turn.
I'd be interested in that too, to make sure everybody gets that. Okay. Just wanted to get back to the issue of definition and the federal role and how we might put something in place here, a framework of some sort that would make sure that we are allowing everybody in Canada to participate, but that we're measuring what we're doing so that we know that we're having success. I wanted to go to Mr. Shillington because we missed out last time. But Mr. Shillington had some disparaging remarks to make about this notion of finding a definition, the time we spent trying to find definition. We've heard this morning across the panel that perhaps a composite poverty line or a suite of indicators. We kind of did that a little bit, but I think got ourselves into a place where it really, in my view, wasn't very helpful in that we moved from LICO to this notion of market basket that Mr. Sarlo has promoted. He'll be coming next week sometime or very soon, and we'll hear from him. But I'd like to hear from Mr. Shillington his notion of what would work in terms of definition and what the federal role should be in this whole exercise.
Thank you. One of the important aspects, first of all, somebody here said that all poverty measures are relative, in that even the market basket we would have today would be different from the market basket in Pakistan, and the market basket we would have today is different than the market basket that we would have had 20 years ago. To me, the critical issue actually is, nobody's mentioned it, is whether or not when the market basket is adjusted to reflect the living standards of Canadians in general, if you accept that should happen. When our standard of living goes up 20%, does the poverty line go up at all, or is there no influence? Some people would argue there should be no effect. And then other people would say, no, we're richer, our obligations to children change. The question is whether, a critical question, because actually it's political, is whether that adjustment is automatic or ad hoc. The low-income cutoffs are called relative because every once in a while they get rebased. And that's what makes them relative. If they're not rebased, they're not relative. They're back to being an absolute measure of poverty where the standard of living doesn't change in time. And the low-income cutoffs were started around 68 and rebased every 7-8 years. And as you well know, they have not been rebased since 1992, which is one of the reasons why reported poverty, if we use LICOs for poverty, even though we're told we shouldn't, is going down because it hasn't been rebased. If you rebase them, I guarantee you the poverty rate would jump. Okay, so Stats Can, basically on its own, as far as I know, decided not to rebase it. It decided to turn a relative measure of poverty into an absolute measure of poverty on its own. Okay, the market basket measure of poverty, created by HRSDC, was created at the behest of the provincial ministers of social services because they thought LICOs were too generous. I can give you I'm not just saying that. I can show you documentation where that's said. And it was designed to reflect living standards of low-income people, not general living standards. And that was part of the control. So it's not a relative measure of poverty. It's a measure of poverty for the poor. And changes to that basket will be subject to the approval of the Provincial Minister of Social Services who set welfare lines. So that would be a wonderful system for them. They can control welfare rates and they can control the poverty line against which they're compared. So the question is, who gets to do the adjustments? So I'm going to round up as quickly as I can. Nobody's really talked much about the low-income measure, which is effectively half median, which is the international standard for developed countries. You heard evidence last week. There is no international standard. I disagree. It's LIM, the low-income measure. Problem is the LIM doesn't do federal geographic adjustments at all. So I would recommend, if I had to come up with a poverty measure, half median with some reasonable adjustments for geographic differences in housing costs, the way MBM did, and that it be adjusted not ad hoc, not subject to the ministers of social services, but annually. That's my preference.
No, I think that was my question. That was good. Thank you.
D'accord. Pardon. Alors, ça compléterait nos travaux. Peut-être juste une question si
that wraps up our hearing. But I do have one question that wasn't brought up, if you will.
You say that wraps up our hearing, but we definitely have time for one more round of Liberal Conservative as written in routine motions.
Right.
So can we have that? We might as well use the full amount of time.
Oui, c'est parce que, M. Lake, il nous reste à peu près 7 à 8 minutes.
Mr. Lake, we have about 7 or 8 minutes, and we have to leave this room ahead of time because there's another committee that is scheduled to sit here at 11 o'clock. As you wish, I could start a new round of questions, but... Do you have a question, Mr. Lake?
Yeah, I actually do. If I could, that's okay? Yeah? Yeah, okay. I guess
Agree.
my question for Mr. Shillington, because we've had a lot of talk today about no need for measures, or the need for measures maybe is overstated. And Mr. Shillington, in your initial opening statement, you referred to an example of a woman from Quebec who's by different measures of poverty, it would be defined very, very differently in terms of the percentages. I think 65%, and you went down to 5% based on a whole bunch of different examples. Now, as I explained before, we're as MPs, we're asked to be stewards of Canadian taxpayers' dollars, and of course there is no real federal dollars. The federal government doesn't have a pot of money that is just the federal government's to spend. It's all Canadian individuals' money. And as stewards of those dollars, when we're talking to our constituents and we're justifying the decisions that we make, we have to be able to explain why we would take money away from one person, a taxpayer, one of our constituents, and give it to another, maybe not taxpayer, but another Canadian citizen. There has to be a reasonable justification. I think that's why it's important that we have measures, and I just wonder how, if you don't have measures, or if measures aren't important, how do you make these political decisions? I would actually ask this question of everybody, because I think that all of you have kind of touched on the fact that the need for measurement is somewhat overstated. So I'd like to kind of hear how you would make those decisions if you were in our position.
My comment about the poverty, the debate over poverty lines as being a diversion was based on having appeared before committees like this for more than 20 years and seeing basically much more debate about what we mean by poverty than debate about what programs could be put in place that would improve the well-being of seniors. That group of senior single women in Quebec, those are federal programs, OAS, GIS. And you're right, you have to be accountable. But if I was to argue that we should increase the GIS to help that woman, I'm sure I would be asked, how much is that going to cost? We can't afford that. The GIS program costs $5 or $6 billion total. The cost of subsidizing the pension incomes and the RSP's incomes of people who will never be in need is measured in the 20s of billions of dollars. So we now, for every dollar we give to a poor senior, I can document this, we spend 4 or 5 public dollars through the tax system subsidizing the incomes of people who will never be needy. And I don't understand why every single time I talk about how we could improve the well-being of low-income people who are needy, I get questions about the cost when it's so easy for us to bring in pension splitting, increased age credit, increased pension credit for people who are not needy and never will be.
Merci, M. Shillington. Je vais permettre une brève question à Mme Dalla.
Thank you, Mr. Shillington. Now, this morning's hearing has been televised, so we do need to leave time to the next committee to set up, but I'll ask Ms. Dalla to ask one more question.
I started off my question, you never had time to answer. The impact of early learning and childcare on poverty. You had spoken very eloquently about improving the accessibility and programs that we have for seniors, like CPP and GIS and some of the other programs. Your thoughts in regards to childcare solutions that are needed to address the issue of poverty?
Yeah, obviously, I would like to see a child care program that works. And actually, I don't think you have to look far. You look across the river. Quebec has a system which may not be perfect, but it's a step in the right direction, both for child care and for maternity benefits. And what part of you mentioned early education. The more evidence I see in my research about RESPs and student loan programs. I just see programs where these programs aren't working, and part of the reason why they don't working is because they're not designed for our children. Our children on the whole aren't eligible. And so they're, again, more restrictive. The child care, I wish I knew more about the specific things that work. I look at Quebec and said that appears to be working better than what we're doing.
Thank you.
On behalf of my colleagues and on my own behalf, I wish to thank you for your respective contributions this morning. Your presentations will be very useful to us. Once again, thank you. And that concludes this morning's meeting. Meeting adjourned.